Good morning. Right? Okay. So let me give you some announcements before we get right into our lesson this morning. So we're having an annual business meeting on the 27th of March. The agenda for the meeting is located right down here by the organ. We encourage you to pick that up. We mentioned to you last week that we're encouraging you to think about right now, studying there. She's going to be going on a missions trip to Life Bible Institute is doing a summer camp there, and possibly help her out. If you give to as far as online or in the offering box or mail them in, with the offering box or mailing with your offering saying that this is to help Samantha with her missions trip. Online, you'll need a fund as a student mission trip, okay? Then guys, April the 9th, less than a month away at men's breakfast. You to be aware of that. This Wednesday, we're going to have a international. He actually will be in Indiana during the day, speaking somewhere, and he'll be giving a world report telling us about what's as far as what God has been doing, especially with regards to what he's been doing since the whole COVID issue in the world. This is the final week for so right down here is a clipboard, okay, and you're fine. You don't need to come check it, but if you come and make sure that everything was done properly, and it's out to you. So we just want to make mention of that. And let's ask God to thank you for your grace, for your love, for your goodness. Would guide us through this study now as we Isaiah, the vision of Isaiah. Give us wisdom to our own lives as well. We ask this. Okay, guys, we are in lesson 6, so I hope everybody picked up a. We're going to start with verse 8, going all the way through verse 12. I may read some section as we go. Now, because we're starting in verse 8, verses 1 to 7 are actually part of this prophecy, but we put it in the other lesson because we were looking at the deliverer. And in verses 1 to 7, it talks about the people who are in the midst of darkness have seen a great light, and that's the Messiah. Okay, it's a prophecy that we often we repeat during Christmas season, okay, because it's a prophecy concerning the birth of Christ. But it's a prophecy, if you look with me at verse 1 and 2, nevertheless, the gloom will be upon her who is distressed, will not be upon her who is distressed. As when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterwards more heavily in Galilee of the Gentiles. A people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. And so it's really a prophecy to the northern part of Israel. Okay? Now, at this point in the prophecy, one kingdom, it's two kingdoms. Okay? Remember the 10 tribes after the death of Solomon, they wanted a little bit of a reprieve oppressive towards the people so that he could gain his status or whatever, and they were just wanting an easing of things, and his son Rehoboam wouldn't do that. And so they split off into their own kingdom, led by Jeroboam. And so the northern kingdom is Israel, sometimes called Samaria. And then there's the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, also called Judah. So this prophecy has to. So we talked about the deliverer. It's a promise of hope to the people of the northern kingdom. Why? Because when we get to verse 8 through 17, he's going to be talking about judgment that's going to come. The northern kingdom is still in existence. Remember, King Ahaz was what? Fearful of them, and that's where the first prophecy came in chapter 7. Don't be afraid of them. By the time this boy is not, by the time this boy is able to distinguish or be old enough. Prophecy, because my mind's frying this morning. He says, "Hear now, O David, is this a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God? Therefore, behold, the virgin shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse evil and do good. Good, the land you dread will be forsaken by both her kings." So it's saying that the northern kingdom will not be an issue anymore. Okay? And we saw that being fulfilled in chapter 8. But we also know there's a far fulfillment of Christ. So that word that's used, that's translated young woman or virgin, it's a Hebrew word that means both. So God used a word that when he mentions it later, we'll use the Greek word meaning virgin. Okay. So he's going to judge. You're going to be like, yeah, this applies to us. No, it doesn't. Are supposed to be God's people. To the warning and to the judgment, we need to look at. So let's go through it. I'll explain what I'm talking about. All right, so first, it records that God sent judgment against, referred to as Israel, and then Judah. Prideful, of hardship, could rebuild itself. That's a lot of pride. Even though, and now they have a new threat from the Assyrians. It doesn't matter what happens to us, we're going to rebuild ourselves. That's just pride. That's just normal. But it should be different, because the oppression that was prophets, if you look through 1st and 2nd, this is happening because of your disobedience to the Lord. So in spite of the hardship, so that Israel, wow, where did that come from? I mean, well, if you remember, when we went through Deuteronomy, Moses clearly warns them. Several hundred years before this, he clearly warns them, God, and you chase after the foreign gods. Warring to mean chasing after tree. He said, over. There's that I over to your enemy that they're not turning back, no matter not turning. Especially if you're raising, keep sending. Like you said, kind of hard from God saying you need to turn or this. They were hearing from, they weren't talking. Pride is a, pride keeps us from severe judgment will rich and poor. Now it's interesting. A lot of times in this, no, that doesn't distinguish. You have the rich do well where the poor don't. Judgment here, when you look at how God uses things, especially when you go to Revelation, you'll see it. He uses pestilence, that's disease, war, those kind of things, economic collapse. You might be able to survive that a little bit, but ultimately it affects everyone. Those kind of things affect the rich as well, don't you? Because you may have a lot of money in the bank, but that's still not going to necessarily keep you from getting sick. And that's sure not going to buy you out of an enemy oppressor coming to destroy your nation, right? And that's what we see happening here. So in verses, he's going to describe the wickedness of the wickedness is described as a fire that is consuming them. So what's consuming them is not some outside issue. What's consuming them is from the inside. They're burning up from the inside out. Their wickedness is destroying them from the inside out. Let's go on. They will not only be judged by God and their enemies, but from within. So the reality is they're going to have a problem here. So let's look at this. Look at verses 18 through 21. For wickedness burns as a fire. It shall devour the briars and thorns, and kindle in the thickets of the forest. They shall mount up like rising smoke. Through the wrath of the Lord, the land is burned up, and the people shall be as fuel for the fire. And no man shall spare his brother. What's it talking about there? No man shall spare his brother. It's talking about internal conflict. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's not just the oppression of God sending judgment on them. It's not just the enemy that God raises up. They're going to destroy each other from the inside out. Do you understand what I'm saying? They will have no regard for each other. They shall be like fuel for the fire, he says here. That's why, can I be honest, when we're talking about the people of God here, when you go over to the New Testament, that's why there are such clear warnings and prohibitions against divisiveness within the body of Christ. When you have conflict within the body of Christ that festers and breeds out and burns, it weakens the church, if not ultimately destroys that local church. So here he's talking about God's people. They're so prideful, they're so boasting, but yet God's going to bring, and they're going to be judged from even within. Brother will take up arms against brother. And here's what it says. They will destroy themselves. They'll destroy themselves. Now, he's going to talk, we get over to chapter 10 now. He's going to talk about the coming disaster. So look with me to the first 4 verses. Woe to those who decree unrighteousness, who decree unrighteous decrees, who write misfortune which they have prescribed, to rob the needy of justice, to take what is right from the poor of the people, that widows may be their prey, that they may rob the fatherless. What will you do in that day of punishment, and in the desolation which will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your glory? Without me, you shall bow down among the prisoners, and they shall fall among the slain. For all his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. All right, so let's talk clear. So he's pronouncing woe on the nation's leaders for 6 sins. Now, as I go through this, there isn't a nation in the world that doesn't struggle with these 6 sins. Okay? But why is he directing his attention to the northern kingdom to punish them for this, but he isn't punishing the other nations? It goes back to who they are. They're the people of God. They should what? Know better. Okay? Among God's people, they shouldn't be acting this way. All the other nations of the world act this way. But here's what it says, okay? So, for making unjust laws. First thing, the decrees that he's talking about here are unjust laws. For issuing oppressive decrees. Taking away justice. Number 4, depriving the poor of their rights. And by doing this, they do, number 5, hurting the widows, robbing the orphans. Now, understand something. So when you have at the bottom rung of their society, so let's picture society, okay? Let's picture the northern kingdom, let's even picture Judah, because they suffered from the same thing. They would be judged later for the same thing. They had the king, they had the priests, the nobles, you've got the rich, the middle class, you've got the lower class. At the bottom rung of society, the destitute. Who were the destitute? The widows, because in their culture, it was the men who would take care of the family. If the man dies and there's no male to help, that widow is left alone. She has no one to take care of her. The widows are at the bottom. Here's the other one down at the bottom. Orphans. No family at all to take care of them. And their society, the people of God, let's remind ourselves, the people of God are in such a state that they're not just issuing oppressive laws, they're not just denying righteous judgment and justice, they're hurting the widows and robbing the orphans. What does that reflect? That as a people of God, they no longer care about who? People. They're only caring about themselves and what they can get. And so God's going to pronounce judgment upon them. This is the woe against them. So here's what he says. The nation will be destroyed by a power that comes from afar. There's something coming that's going to destroy them. And we already know what that is because we're going to hear the discussion of that here in a moment. It's Assyria, the kingdom of Assyria. The kingdom of Assyria would later be defeated by the Babylonians, but for a long time, this is an empire. Assyria would destroy the oppression that's taking place there. They would destroy the northern kingdom. So let's talk about, he moves then to verses 5 to 34. Now, all right, so we're talking about the judgment. So what does the writer do now? So he gave them hope. There's going to be a great light. There's going to be a Messiah. But then, okay, here's the judgment. Then we get to verse 5 of chapter 10, and he's going to talk about God's punishment of the Assyrians. Now, if you would read that, you're kind of like, wow, wait a minute, hold on. I thought God's using them as a tool. Okay? I thought God's using this oppressive people as a tool. And they were very oppressive. So when they would finally destroy the northern kingdom, the way that the Assyrians carried away their exiles is they would put a loop, a metal ring into your lip and attach a rope to it and drag you to where you were going. They were the ones who started the whole process of exiling people. Taking the people from one area, moving them completely far away, and bringing the people that they conquered in the other area and bringing them into the northern kingdom. Why would they do that? That way they could ensure that there were no, what we would call today, guerrilla warfare. People uprising to reclaim their land. Well, now you're going to take them somewhere else. They would never have that problem. So these are oppressive people. So God uses them as a tool. God uses them as a tool. Let me just explain something. God will use the wicked as a tool. God uses Satan as a tool to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. He's God. You know, the great reformer Martin Luther said that Satan is God's Satan, meaning he doesn't have autonomy from God. He rebels, but he still is hindered by the sovereignty of God. Now let's get to the point here. What is God going to do? He's going to pronounce judgment against Assyria. So here's what he's going to do. First of all, in verses 5 through 11, he's going to talk about them being a tool in God's hand. God used Assyria as a rod to punish Israel. Okay? So he's using Assyria as a rod to punish Israel. Even though God used her as a tool, he was not pleased with Assyria. So even though he's using this people, he's not happy with them. Now you're going to see the same thing later on when we get to the other prophets when they talk about Babylon. Babylon was a tool used by God to what? Punish and exile the southern kingdom of Judah. But he wasn't pleased with them. And he'll say later on, you went beyond what I wanted you to do by being as oppressive and brutal. So God he uses them, but he's not pleased with them. So he's not pleased with Assyria. Why? Assyria boasted that its idols were greater than the God of Israel. So, at one hand, if you look, there's going to be an interaction we're going to see here where Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, sends a messenger to King Hezekiah, and he's basically saying that the gods of Assyria are greater than the gods of Israel, and he basically likens the God of Israel to all the other gods that they have defeated, and that the God of Israel, there's nothing he can do. He's going to be useless against the Assyrians. But at some point in the conversation earlier, he mentions that God sent Assyria to punish Judah. But yet he says God is nothing. God then says, here's my judgment on Assyria, and we're going to see it later. And it's the point where a lot of them get killed by God in a night. And Sennacherib runs back home and gets killed by his 2 sons. So it's all because of the pride of Assyria saying that their idols were bigger than God. So God will punish Assyria for its arrogance and pride. They're a tool, but he allowed them to be used to punish the northern kingdom, but he will punish Assyria for its arrogance and pride. Here's the other thing. God promises that a remnant will remain and return to the land. Now again, there's a lot of remnant talk today, if you listen to the radio, if you read things, and you get a sense that the remnant is being talked about today is this group of spiritual people who were left. And God is preserving this spiritual seed. That's not what it's being talked about here. I'll tell you why. If you go to 1st, 2nd Kings, 2nd Chronicles, when the northern kingdom began to turn away to idols, the godly people who were there, most of them left and went down and joined with Judah, because they worship the Lord there. So when it's talking about a remnant here, what is it talking about? He's leaving a group of survivors. He's not letting them be completely stamped out. He's keeping a remnant of those 10 tribes alive. Why? Because he promised them all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant, to the covenant that he gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way through Moses, that he would preserve them as a people. Not because of their spirituality. We've already seen they're not spiritual. They're what? Chasing after other gods. They're having a problem with pride. But God promises that there will be a remnant and they will what? Return to the land. Okay? Return to the land. All right, let's continue on. The Lord assures his readers that the burden of Assyria will be lifted from them. So he's given them a promise. If you're in the northern kingdom, you're like, man, is this supposed to come? What will it be like? He's given them a promise. Yes, this is going to happen. I'm going to punish the Assyrians. And one day this burden will be lifted from you. Didn't tell them when, but one day the burden will be lifted. The oppression will be lifted. And here's what he says. The Lord will defeat the Assyrians. They'll be defeated. And they were. A couple hundred years later, they were by the Babylonians. Destroyed. Now, with this, now we come to chapter 11 into chapter 12. And we're going to talk about the Messiah again. Now, it's interesting to me. Now, when you read this, you gotta be thankful for the graciousness of God. Why? Okay. So you hear all of this judgment. If you do this, this is going to happen. You do this is going to happen. It's going to be oppression and all. Okay, so you see all this judgment, but interspersed in the judgment is hope. So he starts out with hope about the Messiah. People have seen a great light. About the coming Messiah there. Then you hear the judgment, okay? The northern kingdom's going to cease to exist because of your pride. Here's the wicked things you were doing as a people of God. You shouldn't have been doing them. Oh, by the way, I'm going to send this nation against you, but I'm going to deal with them too because they're not right either. And then when you read that, and you're like, oh, but by the way, the burden's not going to be there forever. So then what does he do? Now he introduces again hope. What's the hope here? In the midst of the judgment, what's the hope? One person. The Messiah. That's our hope. Did you understand what I'm saying? That's the hope. Period. He didn't say, I'm going to introduce a great leader. I'm not going to, yeah, he is going to introduce a great leader. In the person of who? The Messiah. You know what the Greek word for Messiah is? Christ. That's who it is. Okay, so let's go on. Let's look at here. All right? The coming kingdom. A ruler will come forth from the line of Jesse. Now, who is Jesse? Anybody know who Jesse is? David's father. Thank you, Bruce. David's father. So from the line of Jesse comes a ruler, all right? Comes this Messiah. He will be empowered by the Holy Spirit and characterized by the fear of the Lord. So this ruler who will come will be from the line of Jesse, the Messiah. He will be what? Empowered by the Spirit of God, and he will be characterized by the fear of the Lord. All right, let's go on. He will judge the nations. Do you understand what I'm saying? He will judge the nations. Let's just stop for a moment. Think about that for a moment. Is there anybody in existence or ever has been in existence that can claim that they do this? I don't care what world leader it is. Does he do this? Does he judge the nations? Do the nations come to him, bow down and say, what's your judgment? If you read through some of the prophecies later, you'll see that He will be enthroned in Jerusalem, and the nations will come to him, and those who don't bring an offering will suffer drought that year. Who controls the weather like that? Nobody. I'd like to know because I'm getting sick of the snow. I'd like to just tell him, please, can we stop now? But that doesn't work, right? This is the one who will judge the nations. He will judge the nations. His kingdom will be marked by peace and harmony among all creation. This is the millennial kingdom, isn't it? His kingdom will be marked by peace and harmony. The Messiah will serve as a rallying point for all peoples. Not just the Jews, but for all people. That's significant for you and I. Why? Because I don't know that we have anybody here that's a Jew by ethnicity, right? So he will gather all of Israel and Judah from the farthest points of the world. They will go back to him. God will be praised because of his anger will be turned away from Israel. God's anger at all these other things will be turned away now. The remnant will remind themselves concerning the greatness of God. The remnant, there it is. Those who remain, that are brought back, will remind themselves of the greatness of their God. And so that's the point there. The point is that, yes, there's going to be this judgment as a people of God. They should have been different. They weren't. He's going to use a punisher, but he's also going to punish the punisher later on. But he gets back to the main point. The hope that they have is in who? This coming Messiah. But we know that Messiah came already, didn't we? And he's going to come again and establish everything, and that's the person of Jesus. Okay, anybody got a question? Anybody got a point they want to ponder? So everybody's okay with the Assyrians then? You know who they are? No questions? No comments. Y'all are a good group then. Okay, so here's what we're going to do then. We're done a little bit earlier, so we'll interact with each other until we get ready for the morning service, okay? All right, coffee's in the back, guys. If you do have a question, you can come down here and I'll answer it, and you don't need to worry about being on the video, okay? All right.